All right, let's get right into it. Back in 1964, a political thinker named James Burnham published a book with a title that was absolutely designed to get a reaction: Suicide of the West. And in it, he laid out this really powerful and, yeah, highly controversial theory about where Western civilization was headed. Today, we're going to break down exactly what he was arguing. And there it is, right on the first page. Burnham does not mess around. He gets right to it, stating flatly that the main political belief system of his day, what he called liberalism, was actively causing the decline of the West. That is a huge claim, right? So let's actually unpack what he meant by that. So the key to really getting this is to understand Burnham's specific definitions of liberalism and suicide. And just to be clear, our goal here is to explore the structure of his argument from 1964, to see how he built his case, piece by piece, whether you end up agreeing with it or not. All right, so let's start at the very beginning. To even build his case, Burnham first had to define what he meant by the word ideology itself. Now, this is really interesting. For Burnham, an ideology isn't just, a set of political opinions. It's more like a closed system, a bubble. When someone with a strong ideology comes across facts that contradict their worldview, they don't change their mind. Instead, they'll either twist the facts to make them fit, or they'll just deny the facts altogether. And his big argument was that by the mid-20th century, modern liberalism had turned into exactly this kind of all-encompassing ideology. Now, he's really careful here to say he's not talking about the classical liberalism from the 1800s. He's talking about a specific modern set of beliefs that he claims had become the sort of default, unquestioned worldview for the Western elite. This quote just perfectly captures his point. Burnham is saying that certain ideas had become so baked into the culture that you couldn't even debate them anymore. They were just treated as obvious truths. And for him, that's a key sign that an ideology is at work. It sets the rules for what's even considered a reasonable conversation. Okay, so what are these specific beliefs that make up this ideology? Well, Burnham actually lays them out in a pretty interesting framework. So to define the worldview he's analyzing, Burnham sets up this kind of side-by-side comparison. For instance, you have the liberal belief that the big roadblocks to progress are things like ignorance or bad social institutions, which we can fix with education and reform. And he contrasts that with an opposing view, which says that, well, maybe some of these problems are just rooted in permanent parts of human nature. This contrast is the tool he uses to make the ideology's hidden assumptions visible. Okay, so that's the theory. But for Burnham, this wasn't just some academic exercise. He argued this ideology had massive real-world consequences. So let's see how he claims it all works in practice. He says ideology is kind of like wearing a pair of colored glasses. It filters and interprets events before they even really hit your brain. And to show what he means, he uses a specific news story from the early 1960s. So here's the initial report that came over the wire. Super basic, right? Just the facts. A clash, a place, some casualties. That's it. Very straightforward. But Burnham points out, look at how it was immediately interpreted by a major columnist at the time. Without knowing anything specific about Chiclayo, the whole event just got slotted into this pre-made story about oppressed peasants and evil landlords in Latin America. The why it happened was just assumed. And then Burnham comes in with what he says were the actual facts on the ground, which completely contradicted that interpretation. And this is the absolute core of his point. The big general theory about social injustice was way more powerful than the specific reality of what happened. The facts were just twisted to fit the belief. So what's driving all this? According to Burnham's theory, it comes down to one powerful psychological engine: guilt. He argues that modern liberalism is fueled by this deep, constant sense of guilt for all the perceived sins of Western civilization. And he uses this really vivid anecdote to make his point. He tells the story of this wealthy young woman who just abandons her life of privilege to go help miners. And for Burnham, this isn't just a personal story. It's a perfect symbol of this guilt-driven impulse he sees at the heart of the ideology. And he says this guilt doesn't just stay personal. It scales up, all the way to massive government policy. He points to programs like the Alliance for Progress for Latin America, a $20 billion program, as a prime example of policy driven by this intense need to do something, to solve a problem and soothe that guilt, regardless of whether the solution actually works. And this, in Burnham's analysis, leads to what he calls selective indignation. Basically, he's arguing that the ideology creates a kind of moral double standard. Things like violations of freedom by right-wing governments are treated as the worst thing imaginable, while similar or even worse actions by left-wing regimes often get a pass or are explained away. Okay, and all of this is building to his final and most dramatic warning, the suicide part of his thesis. So when he says suicide, what does he actually mean? For Burnham, it's not a literal thing. It's a political and psychological process where the dominant ideology basically makes a civilization unable or even unwilling to defend itself from real threats because it no longer really believes in itself. He argues this shows up first as, an erosion of national will, of patriotism, which gets replaced by a preference for international organizations and a feeling that your own country isn't anything special. And then, he says, this leads to a kind of paralysis when you're facing direct threats. He used the failure to stop a communist state from setting up shop in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, as his #1 example of this. And finally, it all results in this really confused and ineffective use of power. It's either used too late, too hesitantly, or for fuzzy ideological reasons, instead of for the simple goal of national survival. Which, you'll notice, brings us right back to where we started. This is the engine Burnham believed was driving the whole process, a worldview so locked in that it becomes immune to reality, leading a whole civilization, in his words, to choose its own decline. In the end, Burnham's theory is, well, it's a pretty stark diagnosis. And look, whether you think he was a prophet or just completely wrong, his book forces you to ask a really timeless question, one that goes way beyond 1964. How much are our own views of the world shaped by an ideological filter? And how would we even know?